Chapter 2. Rissa froze, her stinging back pressed against the cool plaster of the wall. Tegan was watching her from across the yard again, a dangerous smirk on his face. He was probably thinking about how violently she was going to be punished for leaving the salvage yard a second day in a row. Worse yet, she was leaving in daylight, during working hours. She should still be stirring the boiling fabric scraps with her team. But Tegan still wasn't brave enough to stop her on his own, and she was relying on that. She took a deep breath, put her foot on the leg of a broken statue, and reached above her for the edge of the wall. Her shirt pulled out of the dried blood on her back as she moved, but she ignored the pain and threw herself up onto the top of the wall. This was hours earlier than she usually left, and she was surprised about how clean the yard looked with sunlight cutting through the dust. Byron's team was the only one she could see, packing metal scraps into crates. A smith was picking up an order of iron tomorrow. Byron's team would probably be working well into the night. The sharp sunlight flashed off of a beaten metal ceiling tile as Theo dropped it. The sound clattered through the yard, followed by an angry shout from a guard and Theo's cry of pain, though it was impossible to tell from here whether he had dropped the tile on his foot or if the guard had hit him. It was only one cry, so Rissa took one last look around the yard, raised her hand in a quick wave to Talia watching from the fabric warehouse door, and dropped down onto the street. The streets were more crowded than usual, being normal shopping and market hours. Rissa dodged along the edges of the road, her feet in the mud and dust of the gutters, but clear of the people. When she got to the Colosseum, the man at the door laughingly sent her on towards the market. She knew it would be crowded this time of day, but there was no helping it. She spotted the man she was looking for on the edge of the market, recognizing him from the description the guard at the Colosseum had offered. A short guy, with hair the color of sun-baked clay, dressed like an inattentive scribe, his tunic a truly hideous shade of brown. Adrian? Both he and the man he was with stopped at the sound of his name, turning to look at her. Yes? He asked, curiously. I was told you were the one to ask about becoming a gladiator. To give the man credit, he didn't laugh, though his companion did. Rissa understood. She was shorter than Adrian, shorter than most, and was built like a rag doll, all loose, long, inelegant limbs and sharp features. Her dusty hair was cut roughly with dull shears, the color almost matching her nondescript gray eyes. She was not a pretty girl, regularly being mistaken for a boy, and passed for anything from 12 to 25. A slave's collar was clearly visible at her throat, heavy, iron, riveted closed, looking too big for her neck, yet still leaving rough skin where it rubbed. One thing she did not look like was a fighter. Adrian, manager of the Colosseum, smiled at her. You sure you want that? It's not easy work. Can be dangerous and doesn't always end well. It also was pretty much the only way out of slavery without either a patron or a master willing to free you. Gladiators could earn real money, assuming they survived and won a bout or two, and once someone agreed to be a gladiator, no one could force them out. Anyone, slave, peasant, scribe, soldier, or noble, could become a gladiator, and all prior claims were set aside until they retired. It might take years to earn enough to buy her freedom. She might never earn enough, but Delilah could not make her leave the Colosseum until Rissa was ready. I want to be a gladiator. Adrian sighed, looking up at the tall man beside him, as if seeking confirmation that this little girl was crazy. Then he looked back at her. Well, all right, you're sure. But hell, girl! I don't want to insult you or anything, but I'm not. I have the right, and frankly the prerogative, to turn away anyone who is just going to get killed in their first fight. Rissa snorted. The Colosseum was a place for blood sport. The point was that people could and did die. Maybe the man read the thought on her face, because he shrugged. A girl less than half the size of most of my gladiators getting slaughtered without a fight is not a good show. Rissa shrugged, and waited, watching him. Adrian was clearly a bit exasperated. All right, let's get simple here. I'm not taking you on unless you prove that you're not going to get killed in your first fight. This here is Doll. He nodded towards the other man, who smiled down at her. You beat him in a fight, I'll take you on as a gladiator. Deal? Rissa looked the big man up and down. He was a good head and shoulders taller than her, and built like Delilah's biggest guard in full armor. He looked muscular, even in a rough leather tunic, with large hands. He had the kind of broad, overly defined face that lent itself easily to intimidation, but he was smiling, and that smile looked soft. He looked like a big dumb troll. She nodded, agreeing to the deal. All right, then, let's go somewhere a bit less public. Adrian led the way around the corner to an alley between two villas. Neither had windows or doors facing the alley. Rissa watched as Adrian examined the space, then looked towards his companion. Doll, this good? Sure. He glanced her way and she shrugged, stepping into the middle of the space. The big man stepped out to meet her. He held out a hand for her to clasp. What's your name, girl? I don't like fighting people whose names I don't know. She ignored the hand and shrugged. Rissa. Nice to meet you, Rissa. She snorted, surprised at his genial tone. This time, when he smiled, she smiled back. Shall we see what you've got? He sounded bemused, clearly sure that what she had was nothing. She kicked out, her foot landing hard in the center of his chest. He did not fall, but stumbled back, his hands coming up instinctively in a defensive stance. While he was moving, she dropped her shoulder and slammed it into his gut. He reached down to catch her, and she tried to slide out of his reach, but his hand closed around her arm just below the elbow. His hand was large enough to circle all the way around her arm. Rather than try to break his grip, she braced herself, used his arm to lever herself up, and swung a kick at his head. He let go, stepping back to avoid the blow. She kicked again, aiming up between his legs, and he jumped back. She punched him in the chest, and he struck out at her with the soft part of his arm, clearly intending to bat her away. She twisted under his strike, coming up so close that he couldn't block her elbow to his gut. She hit him hard, and he grunted, trying to step back again, but her foot was behind his. His bounce was too far gone to save, but as he tumbled, he caught her arm again. She fell with him, landing hard on the rough stone road. She rolled away, ignoring the feeling of her shirt grinding into the lash wounds on her back. Then she was on her feet. All right, Adrian's voice interrupted. The big man sat back on the street, laughing. I'd say you should take her on, Adrian. She'll be fine. I guess so. You sure you weren't taking it easy on her? The big man shrugged. I mean, she took me by surprise, but... He smiled at Rissa. She's stronger than she looks. Rissa raised an eyebrow at him. It would be less insulting if he hadn't sounded so surprised. Good, Adrian nodded. Then, Miss Rissa, if you don't mind following us, I just have one quick errand to run. Then I'll take you back to the Coliseum and we'll sign your contract. Rissa nodded and looked down at the man sitting on the street. She knew she should offer him a hand up, but didn't. Then he was on his feet, still smiling at her. As they walked back towards the market, Adrian spoke over his shoulder. The butcher has been sending us what can at best be called subpar meat. All I have to do is talk to him, and he'll take care of us, though I will admit I asked Doll to come along because, well, he's Doll. The big man grinned over his shoulder as well. I'm good at glaring. His grin dropped into a flat expression. It was a relatively intimidating expression, but Rissa could see the soft smile still around his eyes, and snorted. She understood, though. No one would screw over someone who looked like Doll to his face. Then a voice called out behind them, a voice that stiffened Rissa's spine. Stop! Right there! Delilah's imperious tone cut across the market, and Rissa was not the only one that stopped in her tracks. The two men turned, with almost matching looks of curiosity, but Rissa did not, until a hand closed around her arm. If it had been anyone else, Rissa would have fought, but it was Delilah's perfectly trimmed nails pinching her flesh. She went still, almost limp, letting Delilah yank her back to Tegan and Trey, who were grinning in anticipation of her punishment. Trey, far newer to the salvage yard, reached out to take possession of Rissa from Delilah, but another hand clenched around his, a big hand, and from the look on Trey's face, strong. Excuse me, but what do you think you're doing? Doll asked, and with him standing next to the guards, Rissa reassessed. Doll was taller than either man by more than a hand. Delilah cleared her throat. I am collecting my property. This slave escaped my salvage yard less than an hour ago. The big man made an unhappy sound, but his hand let go. Trey's hand clenched around Rissa's collar and yanked her towards him. No. Rissa's eyes darted over at Adrian, who was standing with his arms crossed. He suddenly looked significantly more impressive than his stature and appearance should entail. This girl, Rissa, has volunteered as a gladiator. She will fight in the Coliseum until she chooses to leave. Delilah looked affronted. She's my slave. I did not give her permission. Regardless, she has volunteered. She has been accepted. She is a gladiator. She's not your slave anymore unless she leaves the Colosseum before she earns enough to pay for her freedom. Where's her contract? Back at the Colosseum. Adrian lied seamlessly, but judging from her expression, Delilah suspected. And Rissa hadn't been gone long enough to sign a contract. Adrian raised his eyebrows. It hardly matters anyway. You'll get her fee as she earns it. Delilah snorted. As if she could. Why bother keeping her? She's just going to get killed. Will you be paying her fee when she dies in the arena? Nope. And it's immaterial if she wins, loses, or dies seconds into her first fight. She's still a gladiator, and that's her choice, not yours. She belongs to me. Adrian wasn't cowed. Not anymore. She belongs to the Colosseum, which is an institution of the state. You have a problem with that, you can take it up with the Senate. And if I do, I'm a respected scion of a noble family and pay more than my fair share of taxes. You're a scribe with pretensions on grandeur. And I'm the manager of the institution that brings in the single most tax money of any in the city. Go ahead. If you want, I'll talk to Senator Gladys myself. By the gods, woman, he'll be in his seat at the Colosseum in less than an hour, and I can tell him about how the woman in charge of the city's garbage wants to deny me fighters. Then you can explain why you believe yourself more important than civil ordinances. He waited for her to respond, and when she offered nothing, he nodded. Now let go of my gladiator, and we'll be on our way. Rissa raised her eyes, glancing up at the woman who had owned her almost as long as she could remember. Delilah looked as angry as she had ever seen her. Her eyes said it as clearly as if she had spoken. She was going to make Rissa pay. Rissa's expression remained neutral in the face of Delilah's anger, though she was acutely aware of her stinging back. Doll's hand dropped onto Trey's, his fingers prying the smaller man's away. The second Trey's hand released, Rissa stepped back, taking a deep breath. She glanced over at Adrian, and he nodded in confirmation. She was free. Adrian turned on one heel and headed towards the Colosseum. Doll held out a hand, gesturing for Rissa to go ahead of him. Adrian waited until they were well out of Delilah's earshot to explain. The butcher can wait. We need to get that contract signed as soon as possible. Complete bullshit that the contract doesn't matter. Gladys is sympathetic enough to the Colosseum that he might argue for us no matter what, but many of the other senators don't like the fact that everyone has equal rights to be gladiators. For them, let's get the letter of the law filled in. Can you sign your name? Rissa shook her head. An X usually stands fine, but I'll teach you to sign so that no one can argue it's not your mark. Rissa shrugged. So, to save on time, mind if I run through the details of the contract as we walk? She shrugged again. She was signing on, no matter what the details. It's a bit complicated. Anything you miss, you can ask about later. Basics boil down to all gladiators must fight in the arena at least once a week to remain gladiators. There are no requirements as to winning, though of course I suggest you try doing so. Gladiators are only paid for wins, though basic food and board are provided by the Colosseum as long as you continue to qualify as a gladiator. Basic medical treatment for wounds sustained while fighting is also provided, though of course you may bring in your own healers if you would prefer. Clothing, furniture, armor, alcohol, and other non-essential items are not provided by the Colosseum, though basic weapons are. These weapons are to be kept in the training rooms, remain property of the arena, and so are not to be taken off property. Of course, you can also use your own, if you choose. Bows and crossbows are not allowed in the arena. Javelins and other thrown weapons may be used, but any death or injury of an audience member or Colosseum staff will be deemed murder or assault, and are litigated the same way as if you had attacked someone on the street. Poison, deliberately contaminated blades, sedatives, alcohol, or anything that will affect the other combatant's consciousness is strictly forbidden, as are any attempts to incapacitate an opponent before a bout begins. Gladiators are strictly forbidden from interfering with fights they are not involved in or stepping foot in the arena when they are not on the roster. Breaking any of these rules is grounds for immediate end of contract, which, for you, would mean returning to Delilah. Fights in 3 ways. Surrender, when one fighter is incapacitated, or is killed. He stopped speaking suddenly, a small frown on his face. I should have asked this before, but how do you feel about killing? I try not to. Good. Official policy is that killing is part of the sport, but frankly, it's bad for business. We'd run out of gladiators in a year if fights ended in death on a regular basis. And as much as people like the idea of a blood sport, no one wants to watch their favorite bleed out on the arena floor. Plus, I don't like having people under my care slaughter each other. He snorted. I live in the Colosseum too, and I don't want to live surrounded by killers. That being said, I cannot officially punish you if you kill someone in a fair fight in the arena, which means there will be no retribution if anyone kills you. For deaths that occur during matches or are deemed to be direct result thereof, funeral fees will be paid by the winner of the fight. If they do not have enough money, the charges will be covered by the Colosseum. Another reason it's bad for business to have too many deaths. Rissa nodded. She hadn't liked the idea of killing for her freedom. They were back at the Colosseum now, and the guard at the door gave her an amused smirk as they passed. Rissa had never been in the Colosseum before, and she glanced around curiously as they walked. The halls were tall, open, but not exceptionally fine. They were uniform gray, flat, but not smooth. Along the hall, there were wide arches through which Rissa could see sunlight and the open space she suspected was the arena itself. She knew, though she had never seen it, that the arena was lined all around with stepped seating, going almost 4 stories up. She had heard that the Colosseum could hold almost half of the city if people were willing to get cozy, and from what she had heard, it often did, though most days it was less than a quarter full. Cash winning for each bout varies by what kind of match you are fighting, starting at 10 gold and going up from there. Most I've seen from one fight is 50. It's sort of complex and has several variables, so we'll cover that later. Points are accrued in a similar way, with the added complication of the possibility of losing points. We restart counting points every equinox and solstice, so you won't be far behind for long, assuming you win more than you lose. She will, Dahl's voice added, an amused lilt to his tone. Adrian glanced back over his shoulder to grin at the other man. Hope so. He turned sharply, opening a small door to a much less impressive, narrow hallway. There are, of course, 4 basic types of fights here. One-on-one, group bouts, team bouts, and chaos bouts. One-on-one is, of course, self-explanatory. Group bouts set up to 5 fighters against 1, generally one of the best against 3 to 5 lower-ranked fighters. Team fights set 2 teams of up to 5 fighters against each other. Chaos bouts can be up to 10, every fighter for themselves. Winner is last man, or woman, standing. And now we are at my office. Come in and sit down. He held the door for her, and she crossed into the small room, sitting at the desk. It wasn't much of a room, just enough space for the desk, a chair on either side, and a shelf, stacked high with books, parchment scraps, scrolls, slates, account sticks, literally every form of record-keeping Rissa had ever heard of in a haphazard pile. Adrian crossed immediately to the shelf, pulling out a sheet of parchment and crossing to his seat without taking his eyes off of it. Rissa glanced around, unsure what to do. Dahl was still standing by the door, leaning against the wall. He smiled at her, offering a wink before nodding back towards Adrian, who finally looked up, a curious expression on his face. Dahl? I figured I could show her around when you are done with the contract. A fine idea. But any questions so far, Miss Rissa? She frowned, but shook her head. Adrian sat back in his chair, watching her. What's the frown for? She shrugged. You don't talk much, do you? She shrugged again. All right. He watched her silently for a while. You still sure about this? Yes. Was it the miss? She snorted. Doesn't matter. Easy to fix, Rissa, but a hell of a lot harder if we have to guess. What's wrong with miss? Sounds, she shrugged, dismissible. He frowned, balancing a pin on his finger. Does a bit, doesn't it? So, just Rissa. Any questions on the contract? She shook her head. Good. I'm going to write your name on this scrap. You just have to copy it right here, all right? He showed her how to hold the pen, dipped it in the ink, and watched as she did her best to copy what he had drawn. It wasn't the cleanest copy, with splotches of ink and thin, scratchy lines, some of which went in very different directions than Adrian had drawn. At least no one will accuse me of signing it myself. And with that, congratulations, Rissa. You're a gladiator. I'll set your first fight for tomorrow, if that's all right. Rissa shrugged. You don't have to worry about winning. I'd really prefer to give you a day or 2 to settle in, but Delilah does have pretty good amount of pull in the Senate, and once you've fought in the arena, no one can argue you're not a gladiator. She shrugged again. Well, I'll give you the rest of the details tomorrow. I have to move some things around to get you on the roster. I'll let Doll show you around and get you set up for the night." She looked back over her shoulder at the man still standing by the door. "Don't worry about Doll. You can trust him." She raised her eyebrows at the big man. "I also kicked his ass." Doll laughed merrily. "I was surprised, little girl. You won't catch me off guard next time." She snorted, rolling her eyes. Adrian laughed as well. "Glad to see you two getting along. Doll, take her to watch a couple of bouts. I doubt she's been to any." The big man nodded and reached out to rest his hand on her back to guide her out of her seat. She slid out of the way before he made contact, and he stepped back, his hands held out as a clear visual apology. He was silent as he led her out the door and back the way they had come, but when they were alone, he glanced over his shoulder at her. "I was thinking of taking you under my wing, as it were, sort of an apprenticeship. I've been at this a while, and it's not uncommon for new gladiators to need a little guidance. Not in the arena, necessarily, but in how life works here. But if you'd prefer to make your own way, it won't hurt my feelings." His back was to her, so she couldn't see his face, but quietly she snorted. His tone was soft, clearly trying for neutral, but Rissa had no doubt it would hurt his feelings if she turned him down. She had known the man for less than an hour, and she was already building a picture of him. A man fully aware of how physically imposing he was and trying hard to offset it by being as genial and friendly as possible. He struck her as fragile, harmless, though she was aware the second half of that thought could be seriously flawed. He was bigger than her, stronger than her, and a trained fighter. If he had been aware of what she was capable of and serious about beating her, that little sparring match might have gone very differently. Though Rissa was still pretty sure she would have won if she had had reason to be truly serious herself. She smiled at the man's back and offered, "It's fine." Then he turned, smiling at her broadly. "I'll show you the fresh meat dorms first." He pushed into a big open room, stopping at the door to let her look around. It didn't look much like a dorm at first glance. The dorms at the salvage yard were small spaces, barely enough for the dozen who slept in each room to lay down at once. They had scraps of blankets, cushions, made from salvage, and a small hearth with a smoky fire, usually burning already once burnt coal. The room below her was one large open space, with a balcony ringing the edge where Rissa and Doll stood. The walls here were not as solid as elsewhere in the Colosseum, with cubbies left where chunks of plaster and cement had collapsed, and cracks that ran almost all the way up to the ceiling. There were sections along the walls blocked off with scrap lumber and sheets of stained fabric, making little cubicles. The only windows were on the far side, over halfway up the wall, and when she looked out them, Rissa realized the room was mostly underground. The center of the space was full of people she guessed were gladiators, some milling about, some chatting, some playing at dice, some fighting in the middle of the space. One man seemed to be mending a hole in his tunic, but none were sleeping. After looking around for a moment, she saw piles of cushions and blankets shoved off to the side. There were no hearths, but there was a small door that looked like it led to a kitchen. There are only about 20 fresh meat fighters right now, but gladiators stay in the fresh meat dorms unless they earn enough to rent one of the private rooms above. There's no private space here, so when it starts to get late, I suggest claiming a spot along the wall. No one polices this area, and while Adrian doesn't take on people he knows are killers, I wouldn't trust every gladiator with my back. Any violence that doesn't incapacitate someone before a bout is generally ignored. Blankets and cushions are provided by the arena, and I know Adrian gets new ones each season, but at least when I was down here, there were never enough. So if you can get one, hold on to it. He smiled apologetically at her. I know it's terrible, but once you make friends, it's easier, and hopefully you won't be down here long. Rent on the private rooms is only 10 gold a week, so once you pay for your freedom, you just have to win one bout a week to have your own room. It honestly didn't seem terrible to her. It was cool, but not cold, nice and open. She glanced down at the gladiators below. Even from the balcony, Rissa could tell she was by far the smallest person in the room, but she was used to being one of the smallest people in the room. And at the salvage yard, the guards had had free rein to wander in and out of the dorms whenever they wanted. She was used to sleeping with one eye open. "You still sure about this, little girl?" Rissa turned a sharp glare on Doll. "Don't call me little girl." He raised his hands in a defensive gesture. "All right, Rissa." A playful smile cut across his broad features. "Little Rissa." She rolled her eyes, but couldn't exactly argue the point. He was still smiling at her, and she snorted, turning back to look out over the room. A few of the gladiators had spotted them and were watching her, clearly talking about her. She met their gazes and held each until they looked away. Yes, some laughing at her, but that could be dealt with later. Don't start any fights yet, little Rissa. You want to catch them off guard in the arena, which you can't do if you kick their asses down here. Save your skills for the audiences. That actually wasn't bad advice, and begrudgingly she nodded. She knew how to avoid fights as well, if not better than she knew how to win them. I'll show you the kitchen, then we'll head up to watch a few bouts. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him reach to take her elbow, but he stopped himself, instead gesturing towards the stairs down into the room. I'm sure you've noticed the guys training in the middle of the room? I don't suggest it. Even once it becomes common knowledge what you can do, you don't want to let anyone study your technique, more than you have to. Training down here is just showing off. He said the last as he was passing one of the small boxing matches, and one of the men scoffed, obviously having heard. Dahl turned his friendly smile on the man, who backed off, seeming to think better of the challenge he had been about to issue. Dahl didn't even keep his eyes on the man long enough to see that, turning back to head on towards the kitchen, unconcerned. The kitchen serves all the gladiators, though a good number of us buy our own food. While Adrian tries to maintain a certain degree of quality, he's not given a huge budget to feed over 100 people, including the gladiators, messengers, bookies, and kitchen staff. But if you are eating Colosseum food, you've got to come here. Only the top 5 get food delivered to their rooms, which is ironic considering none of the top 5 eat Colosseum food. Hell, Caesar has an entire kitchen staff that lives and works out of the villa next door. And in a truly Caesar move, he has them cook large amounts of food each day to sell to gladiators tired of Colosseum fare. Doll, long time no see, a woman standing over a roasting hog called, dropping the ladle she had been using to baste the beast back into a pot and wiping her hands on her apron before she walked over to greet them. Can I get you something to eat? He smiled at the woman, even when she wrapped an arm around his waist, stepped back and patted him on the shoulder like he was a small boy. Oh, no thank you, Marisol. This is Rissa. She's going to be a new gladiator, so make sure she gets fed. Rissa was still staring around the kitchen. She understood the place had to feed a lot of people, but it was huge. There were at least a dozen people, men, women, and children, rushing about, and there was food everywhere. There was a rack of bread that would have been enough to supply a bakery, 3 hogs roasting on 3 separate hearths, 4 pots big enough for Rissa to curl up in on 4 more hearths, and an open door in the far side showed a pantry stacked full with rounds of cheese wrapped in cheesecloth, vegetables, fruits, herbs, dried meats, jars of olive oil, honey, and things Rissa couldn't identify at a glance. It was by far more food than Rissa had ever seen in one place. Want something now? Dahl's voice cut through her thoughts, and from his tone, he had noticed her attention had wandered. She shrugged, still not quite able to take her eyes off a pile of apples overflowing a basket on one of the tables. Dahl reached over and handed her one. She instinctively went to tuck it in her shirt, to hide it for later, but stopped herself. Dahl, the cook sighed. Those are for tonight's stew. Rissa's hand drew back, pulling the apple close to her as if that would keep the woman from taking it, but when the cook saw the movement, she stepped back. Fine. One won't hurt. Rissa couldn't help glancing cautiously up at Dahl, who smiled down at her. It's all right, Rissa. We're allowed to come for food any time the cooks are at work, though Marisol prefers us to come during normal meal times. The cook snorted and reached out, clearly intending to pat Rissa on the shoulder the way she had Dahl, but Rissa stepped back, out of her reach. The cook looked affronted, but Dahl smiled and gestured for Rissa to precede him back out into the dorm. As soon as Dahl wasn't watching, Rissa tucked the apple in her sleeve.